had to register it as, 10-2, because they need to unwire everything and just get out of the class, so we have to register at 20 to 2:28 at the,
Okay.
so we'll start the recorder, but we'll cut until it starts, and we'll cut the question period.
Okay.
Cut the podcast, but he's recording for,
Okay.
He's doing transcript and I'm taking in the sound for the podcast or.
Okay, sounds good.
oh, you're welcome. Okay, now we're ready. My face seems well. Please blink. Quand il blink, il enregistre pas. Même si les barres montent, quand il blink, it's not recording. Puis là, il enregistre. All of so, I leave it there. I have a little bit of control, so you know how to talk.
Also, I have a quick question. Will the live stream be available to watch again?
Yeah, it's available live right now. It's available after, I don't know if you saw the poster.
Oh, yeah.
If I'm not counting the poster, then we're laying the poster there.
Okay, cool.
But if you're not sure when you go to your house, it should be a podcast person, you can write to that person. You can leave my email if that helps.
Okay, I'll share.
It is in the that this morning because we created the event to the faculty.
Okay.
So yeah, the info is there.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, we might wait through the article and stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
That looks like the individual.
And in exchange, we might ask you guys for a picture. You guys want to do a picture?
Oh,
Just for our meeting.
Oh, sure.
I like my email.
Okay.
So, just if you guys, you're allowed to
just
take
take
a
that
picture,
note.
and
Yeah.
you guys just for a free for today.
Yeah, sure. It's not really up to me guys to take pictures, but I'll.
No, if it's something possible, or not. If it's not, then it's not.
We have this till 2:30 though, right?
Pardon me?
We have it till 2:30 though, right?
2:30,
Or we
yes.
wrap up at 10?
Yeah.
Okay.
So at 2:20, we have to start wrapping up, because he needs to unplug all his equipment, he's got tape everywhere,
Oh, okay.
and we need to be out for the next class, so,
Okay.
yeah.
Which, where did I move my tape? There it is.
So we started recording, so Derek and I will go.
Okay.
We'll come back, around 2:15, we'll wait,
Yeah,
and
and
then
that'll
we'll
be okay.
see if we can help or anything,
Perfect.
okay?
Thank you.
We have there from the Fulcrum, the student newspaper.
Okay.
So they might ask for, we said to ask the speakers if they wanted to have a picture.
Okay. Perfect.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect.
Okay, thank you so much.
Okay, you all set?
We're gonna try through this gentleman, if that doesn't work, we'll get to the.
Are you guys good?
Yeah, well, actually, Josh has one question, but, before that, where would you recommend somebody park? I park in the Brooks, is that?
Yeah,
Yes.
Brooklyn's would be best.
Okay.
It's our only payable
Yeah.
parking.
Great. Thank you.
You have a question?
It might be about, getting the AV in, the recordings.
It's live stream
Yeah.
on YouTube, so
Yeah.
you can pull it from there.
So once the recording's done, we won't be there anymore, is that?
No, she's posted, I'll just double check with,
She is?
Jackie. Where is it?
Still be available. Yeah. Okay, that's great.
When is the video available on that too, during the stream?
Well, if it's going on YouTube, if it's YouTube.
Okay.
And
Unless
other
someone,
guys-
unless someone puts like some song lyrics and then the song artist, has their lawyer send a takedown request. Because the way YouTube works, of course, is that they're absolutely neutral, they're like, you know what? If there's any kind of legal claim, then we sort of pass you on to the person that you want to make the claim with, and la la la. And they get to wash their hands of.
On top of the screen where you're recording this hard, like the hard copy?
You know, I'm not sure, but here, is there like a permanent recording that's being made somewhere on the server? Or,
Moi, je l'enregistre sur
Okay. Ça laisse,
ça, même temps. Horrible. I'm on the paleo diet and everybody's eating pizza.
There's a salad there.
I'm a pizza fanatic.
So, here's what, like, yeah, just here and then I'll.
Microphone's right there.
Yeah.
That's how you go.
Oh, should I go there?
No.
Is this Will?
Yeah.
The order is Chief, then you, then Will.
Should we sign?
And Allison.
Well.
Nice to meet you.
So I'm not actually really sure what's going on here. This is a webinar. Oh, it's a webinar.
So, it just means we're broadcasting it for the world to.
Oh, that's handy.
Should have told him that. No, a very
And now I'm
select
sweating,
number
I
of
need a
people have
towel.
access to it, students.
Okay.
Yes.
People who have a link, only if you've got the link.
So is there going to be people asking questions online?
Is that what that is?
Do we have moderator? We have moderator. That's-
Do you have everything you need?
Yeah, just for the.
Yeah.
Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. Okay, cool.
Just checking.
Can everybody stop eating pizza in front of me?
Craig was saying that, like,
No.
Probably not a good idea.
No. Well, I'm not. I don't eat wheat.
so Craig was saying, like, for our introductory comments, like, 5 minutes or so, talk just about, like, for you, the importance of the valley and the effect the dam's gonna have on treaty rights and what you always say. And then I'll talk about the Portuguese. And then we'll talk about undrip, and Craig will talk about something else, I can't remember. Make sense?
Sure.
Just what you always say about, how important this is.
5 minutes. Is somebody keeping time? I tend to start talking
But 10 to 15 minutes
and
is
zone
fine.
out.
Okay, I'll do a little,
Throw
like
something.
a 2-minute
Throw something
warning
at me.
on there. Okay, we better get started.
While you were talking, I was watching Emily wolf down that pizza.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Before I begin with our introductions today, I want to first acknowledge the Algonquin traditional territory that we are on today, and thank the Algonquin people for providing us with the space today to speak and share and learn from one another. Today marks the 9th anniversary of the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And so it is fitting that we are meeting today with members of the Treaty 8 Justice for the Peace Caravan to discuss treaty rights, the UN Declaration, and the CITE hydroelectric dam. Yesterday, the Federal Court of Appeal in Montreal heard the latest legal challenge to the CITE dam already under construction on Treaty 8 territory in northeastern British Columbia. And today we're privileged to hear from some of the individuals who have been involved with that challenge. So we have Chief Wilson with us today. He was first elected as the Chief of West Moberly First Nations in 2000 and has continued to serve in that position for the past 12 years. He currently sits on several boards and councils, including the BC First Nations Energy and Mining Council, the BC First Nations Gaming Committee, the Pacific Trans Pipeline First Nations Limited Partnership, and the Northeastern Aboriginal Business and Wellness Center. He is an activist for land and treaty preservation and has presented at numerous universities and institutions, the Department of Justice, and twice before the Standing Senate Committee on Aboriginal Peoples. We also have with us today Alison Rana. Alison Rana has been providing legal advice to First Nations on a variety of issues, including the Crown's legal obligation to consult, breach of fiduciary duty, Aboriginal and treaty rights, and various Indian Act and governance matters for the past 15 years. She has appeared at all levels of court in BC and Alberta and has been involved in litigating a number of leading cases, including Mikisew Cree in the Supreme Court of Canada. She has intervened in numerous appellate level cases and has also appeared before the Specific Claims Tribunal. We also have with us Will David. Will David is currently a senior advisor with the Assembly of First Nations. He holds a degree in environmental engineering science from MIT and a law degree from the University of Ottawa. He has worked on environmental contaminants issues as a research for Mohawk Council of Akwesasne and with ITK. Finally, we have Craig Benjamin. Craig Benjamin is with Amnesty International. He is a member of the campaign staff of Amnesty International Canada, where he coordinates the organization's work to promote the human rights of Indigenous peoples. Over the last 15 years, Craig has worked with Amnesty International, focusing on issues such as missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, access to basic services in reserve communities, and the social impacts of large-scale resource development projects. Craig has coordinated Amnesty International submissions to a number of high-profile tribunals, inquiries, and court cases, including the Chocolatine title case from the Supreme Court of Canada, the Child and Family Services case at the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, the environmental assessment of the New Prosperity Mine, judicial reviews of the proposed Site C Dam and Northern Gateway Pipeline, and the Ipperwash Inquiry in Ontario. Please join me in welcoming them here with us today. We'll begin with remarks from Chief Wilson.
Thank you. First, I'd like to start off by thanking the Algonquin Nations for allowing us to be here today and having this discussion on their territory. We find ourselves a long way from home. We are from northeastern BC, Treaty 8 territory, with the westernmost Treaty 8 First Nation in Treaty 8, I believe, less than halfway river. I am Rowan Wilson, Chief of the West Mobility First Nations. I have with me today my council, Councillor Dean Doherty's over on the side there. I also have Councillor Clarence Wilson is here, not in the room, but, and I guess ex-councillor Laura Webb. Chief Lynette Chicoza from Prophet River is not able to join us today. She's supposed to be here, but they were having a by-election in their community for a councillor that had passed away. So she sends all her blessings and thanks everyone for allowing this to happen as well. So, we were here today, well, yesterday in the Court of Appeal to argue the Site C case. Site C is a hydroelectric project located in northeastern BC. It's the third large-scale hydroelectric dam on the Peace River. There are two existing facilities there called WAC Bennett, which created, when constructed in 1969, created the Wilson Reservoir, which has been an ongoing impact to the Treaty 8 First Nations ever since. In 1980, I believe, somewhere in the 80s, they commissioned the Peace Canyon Reservoir and created Peace Canyon Dam and created the Dinosaur Reservoir. Those two infrastructures on the Peace River have taken up 80% of the Peace River. They have fragmented the construction, the creation of the Wilson Reservoir have fragmented the caribou habitat up there to the point of there being less than 400 caribou in the South Peace territory. They have been listed as endangered on the Species at Risk Act, and being that there's less than 400 caribou in the South Peace, they are no longer sustainable to hunt. They are under conservation orders, and our nation, West Mobility First Nations, have put in place our own conservation orders that where we have not hunted caribou since the creation of the Wilson Reservoir. I turned 50 this year, and I've not shot a caribou in my territory because there's so few of them. We have a recovery plan in place, and we're working on trying to bring the caribou back. Wilson Reservoir also contaminated all the fish with methyl mercury, large-scale hydroelectric dams. It's one of the big environmental footprints that happens with the hydroelectric facility. All the fish in the tributaries that touch the Wilson Reservoir, there's some close to 300 tributaries, all of them have mercury issues with them, as well as the Dinosaur Reservoir. So we can't eat the fish. Now, under Treaty Number 8, we have the right to hunt, fish, and trap, carry on a way of life after the treaty as if we had never signed the treaty. So there's not supposed to be any forced interference. In 1980, the British Columbia Utilities Commission turned down the first go-round on Site C. They told BC Hydro and British Columbia that Site C was not needed. The BCUC is a public oversight body that looks at these capital infrastructure projects in British Columbia. They told BC and BC Hydro that Site C, you haven't demonstrated the need for Site C. Go look at geothermal energy. That's a better alternative than large-scale hydroelectric projects. Now we find ourselves in 2017 in court on Site C again. The joint review panel during the process between the federal and provincial government, a 3-panel group, stated in their report that BC Hydro, once again, has clearly not demonstrated the need for Site C. And that 30 years ago, or 30 years ago in 1980, when they told, when the BCUC told them to go look at geothermal energy, they had not done that. BC and BC Hydro ruled out the viability of geothermal energy in BC. It was not a viable option for them. BC commissioned a report from KPMG, and KPMG, that report got leaked. And the report was to look at geothermal capacity in BC. The report stated that geothermal is 100% viable in BC, and it is a cost-effective alternative to the Site C dam. From the very beginning of this whole process, we have said, our nation, the West Wobbly First Nations, my community members, have said, we're not opposed to the creation of the energy. What we're opposed to is the destruction of this valley. There's absolutely no reason to destroy the last 20% of this valley in order to create that energy. When they made the announcement that they were going to move forward, that was the end of a consultation process. Once they said we were moving forward with sites, they made their decision. Consultation ended, it became an information process at that point in time. They were informing us of what their decisions were, and we've been in that process ever since. Geothermal is highly viable in northeastern BC. Shale gas is the industry right now in northeastern BC is shut down right now because of the global market conditions. But shale gas is the alternative for BC for LNG. They're going to develop the gas, ship it to the coast through these massive pipelines, turn it into LNG and ship it over to other countries so that they can burn it for energy. But meanwhile, they pass a no greenhouse emission policy in BC, and they will not burn it in BC. If this gas is the cleanest burning fossil fuel, according to BC, in the world, and we're shipping it to other countries, why aren't we considering doing it here? With the technology that we have in BC and in Canada, we were a world leader in technology. We invented the space arm. There's got to be a way that we can figure out how to use gas here. Use it in combination with wind. Northeastern BC has the highest recorded wind energy in all of Canada. But for some reason, they've got their hearts and minds set on Site C and destroying the last remaining valley that we have. There is no other valley like the Peace River Valley. It's unique in itself. The waters, it's the only place in the whole Rocky Mountain span that the waters go from the west side of the Rockies, travel through to the east side. They go opposite to every other river in in BC. Everything goes west. This river goes east. It brings warm western wind from the coast through the middle of the Rocky Mountains, and northeastern BC, we're able to grow cantaloupe, watermelon. The Boons, one of the families on the Peace River that are being flooded, have a pear tree. There's enough agricultural land, Class 1 and Class 2 agricultural land, the only Class 1 and Class 2 agricultural land north of Williams Lake in BC to feed over 1 million people. And BC is proposing to put it underwater and destroy it forever. Just for that mere fact, outside of the treaty and everything else, just for the mere fact that it's the only Class 1 and Class 2 agricultural lands, it should be saved. It should be protected, and it should be cherished for future generations, just for that mere thing. For our sake, we say, because of our treaty, you can't put the last 20% of the river valley in jeopardy. We have treaty rights that are protected under the Constitution of Canada, and they're treading all over it. We're here today to talk about UN Declaration on Indigenous Rights. Well, the Prime Minister Trudeau's decision to allow these permits to be issued is a direct violation of undrip. They do not have prior informed consent from us. They don't have it. We've not given it to them. And yet they choose to ignore that. Free prior informed consent. BC in themselves talk about a new enhanced relationship. There is nothing new or enhanced about what they're doing. It's all a pack of lies, you know. And it was hard yesterday to sit in the courtroom and listen to their lawyers say the words that they said, knowing that they were making things up. There's not been a consultation process. We've had one meeting with any decision maker of the federal government on the Site C file. That was Minister LeBlanc. That was the first actual sit-down meeting we ever had with anybody since this process started that had a decision-making authority on this file. We met with McKenna, who is the Minister of Environment. But we met with her after they issued the certificate, environmental certificate. So her decision was already made. Minister LeBlanc, the new DFO minister, could have held off on his issuance of the permit until after the court cases were done. But we met with them for 1 hour in Vancouver. They all sat there, scribbled in their notepads, they didn't even ask any questions. They shook their heads, they listened to us. They got up after the hour and left, went back to Ottawa. And a week later, they approved the permit. That's not consultation, right? How is that reconciliation or accommodation? Minister Judy Raybould-Wilson, she is the Minister of Justice now. She's an Aboriginal lawyer. She was a BC Regional AFN chief. She came to northeastern BC and she paddled with us on the river twice. She stood beside me and stated that what BC and Canada are doing to the First Nations in northeastern BC is running roughshod over us. She is now the Minister of Justice. She has the ability to stop this process until after the court hearings are done. But she's silent. Now, I have to believe in my heart she's silent because she's been told. She has to toe the Liberal line. We know that there's meetings happening between Christy Clark, the Premier of British Columbia. We know there's meetings going on with the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau. It's been publicly stated that she's traveled over here at least 20 times to meet with them. All the while, we've never been able to meet with the federal government. This is not free, prior, and informed consent. They're not abiding by it. You know, saying the words is different than implementing the words. You know, this is just the same old, same old. There's no new enhanced relationship with the British Columbia. There's no free and prior informed consent, United Declarations. You know, it's all jibber jabber. You know, he made promises to get himself elected. He's being elected. Where's the relationship with the First Nations? This is the biggest project in BC history, and if not Canadian history. $8.8 billion now is where it sits. It's going to be over $15 billion. If this is not a priority to engage in free, prior, informed consent, if it's not a priority to build relationships with the Indigenous people of Canada, what is? There is not going to be another project like this. I don't know if I have anything else to say.
Thank you. Allison?
I'll speak briefly about the litigation. That's what I'm involved in. Yesterday, as Chief Wilson said, we were in Montreal at the Federal Court of Appeal. The reason we were in Montreal is because that was the soonest court we could get a hearing in. We filed our notice of appeal in the federal, from the federal court decision last fall, so it's been almost a year. And we tried to get an early hearing. It took several months before we could hear back from the court about whether that was even possible. And by the time we were able to even talk dates with them, they were looking at the fall schedule. So it's important to understand that this project has been under construction now for over a year. So waiting for court dates while the project is being constructed isn't in anybody's interest. Although it's an appeal and we didn't succeed in the first round, if we do end up succeeding and they're building it in the face of that, that's a concern, I think, for all Canadians, because there's something wrong with the system. We should be able to get appeal dates sooner than that. So the appeal that we argued yesterday was in relation to the federal government's approval of the project in October 2014. The BC government also approved it. This is a joint environmental assessment, so both governments were involved and had a joint panel hearing. And both governments needed to approve it, and both did on the same day, on October 14th, 2014. And the First Nations filed judicial review proceedings in both the federal court in relation to the federal approval and in the BC Supreme Court in relation to the provincial approval. So we have two court proceedings running in parallel with each other right now. We are in appeals in both. The appeal for the BC decision is in the first week of December in Vancouver, and we are now waiting for the outcome of the appeal that we argued yesterday. Of course, court cases always arise in certain fact situations, and this one arose out of the federal government, which was the cabinet, their decision, their ultimate decision to provide approval under the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act 2012 to allow the significant adverse environmental effects to be justified. And it's important beyond Site C. It really has implications for all major projects, especially in the treaty context. And this is because what the government ultimately did when they approved the environmental effects after 7 years of consultation and hearing process and information gathering was to say, we've justified the effects under our policy-making, decision-making power as cabinet, and we've concluded that the consultation was adequate, but they have admitted that they did not consider and conclude whether or not this particular project with its magnitude actually infringes the treaty. And if any of you that are here that are from practicing, like if you're in law school or you're practicing lawyers, you'll understand the nuance there. There's a line of cases that over the last decade or so, in the treaty context, we don't normally talk about infringements of treaty anymore because the numbered treaties, of which Treaty 8 is one of them, provide the Crown with the ability to take up land for certain purposes, and hydroelectric has been considered to be one of those purposes. And so typically the Crown just needs to fulfill its obligation under the honor of the Crown to consult adequately, and then they can proceed to take up the land. However, there are limits to that, because of course if you keep on taking up land, eventually there will be no land left, and treaty rights cannot be practiced in any meaningful way. And the courts have acknowledged that if time comes when so much land has been taken from a First Nations traditional territory, and they have no meaningful right remaining, then they would have a treaty infringement claim, that the treaty no longer has meaning and they can't exercise their rights under it as they were promised. So the judicial review that we brought forward in relation to the federal government's decision was to say they really didn't meet their constitutional obligation to make sure that in making a decision of this magnitude, they weren't actually overstepping and infringing the treaty. And as Chief Wilson said, in northeastern BC, we already have 2 major hydroelectric dams on the same river. Very little stretch of this river in the province remains. But in addition to that, there's widespread oil and gas development, fracking, forestry, mining, wind towers. Any industry that I can think of, I think, exists in northeastern BC. When you fly over 38 and you look out the airplane window, all you see are the impacts on the land. So and for, I'd say, at least as long as I've been doing this, since the late 1990s, there have been outcries from First Nations and even local residents that we can't handle and sustain these cumulative effects. There have been studies done. There's been litigation. The Blueberry River First Nation has sued the British Columbia government for treaty infringement for the totality of all of those impacts. So it's sort of the mantra up there, and it has been for a long time, that the BC government is only interested in the economy, and they're going to develop and develop and develop, and everybody else can just take a back seat. And so when CITE came back to the fore in 2006, 2007, it was just one more major development that the First Nations and the local people were going to have to deal with. So it seemed like the perfect storm, and clearly any government that was taking its responsibilities under treaty and the Constitution and the honor of the Crown seriously, they would say, okay, we better make sure that the treaty can sustain another impact like this. And we should assess whether or not we are now reaching the stage of infringement. And certainly throughout the environmental assessment process, the First Nations were saying exactly that. This is an infringement. Now, for those of you that study law, you know that infringements can be justified. It's not a veto, and you know, of course we've got the undrip discussion which we'll have under international consent model. But under Canadian law, we're not there at this point, and we have consultation and accommodation, and if there's infringement, you have justification under the Sparrow test. So it's a higher standard of government being required to justify their decisions that have a negative impact on treaty rights. So they're looking at whether or not the benefits outweigh the harm. Has minimal impairment been achieved? So have the treaty rights been harmed as little as possible? Are they using the right method, or is there an alternative that would be less harmful? And so it's a kind of a cost-benefit analysis, but specific in the First Nation context, not your typical government polycentric public policy decision-making, but it's focused on First Nations. So we don't get to argue that very much anymore, but this is certainly a case where it cried out for it. And what happened was, when the Order in Council issued in the fall of 2014, and we saw that there was no mention made in it when the government approved the impacts, that they had even looked at infringement, we thought, well, if they had, they certainly must have concluded that it wasn't one, because they've issued the Order in Council, and we followed the judicial review, and Canada's response was asking the court to strike out any reference in our proceedings to infringement, saying infringement can only be dealt with in a trial. Infringement wasn't in front of the Governor and Council. The Governor Council didn't look at infringement. So there we had our answer. If it was implicit in there, now we know they didn't do it. They simply looked at consultation, and they said, okay, we think in all the circumstances this can be justified. So quickly, our judicial review proceedings shifted to a very narrow focus, which is what makes it's narrow in the context of the CITE case, but it's very broad in the context of precedent setting for other projects in the future, because we're saying when these circumstances arise and these decisions of the federal government under CITE 2012, these Section 52.4 decisions, they're not that common. These are the projects that are designated projects under environmental assessment legislation, so they're major projects, and we don't have that many of them. We seem to have a lot of them in northeastern BC, mind you, but the projects are designated projects, and they're projects where the minister responsible has found that there are significant adverse environmental effects that cannot be mitigated. So once you apply all conditions and mitigation measures, the effects remain, right? So when there's still these significant adverse environmental effects, then the decision goes to the governor and council, and they have to justify it at that level in cabinet. So we're saying when those significant adverse effects, which is I think what's one of the important things for CITE, is the panel, the joint panel that conducted the environmental assessment, made many findings that these adverse environmental effects were actually adverse effects on the use of lands and resources by Aboriginal people. So they were about fishing, access to spiritual sites. The whole Peace River Valley, as Chief Wilson mentioned, it's sort of there's no valley like this, and the panel confirmed that position, that it's very unique and it sustains not only the agricultural values, but the cultural and historical values for the First Nations are significant. Because BC Hydro has had its eye on this valley for decades, they have had a flood reserve, an order in council from the provincial government that prevents all development in there because they were sort of saving it for Site C. But what that ends up doing is protecting it, because you couldn't develop it for anything else except these pioneer farmers that have lived there for generations. So they inadvertently, created a sanctuary, like a refugia for calving grounds. It's an incredible ecosystem, and the panel acknowledged all of that. So we're saying when you have a circumstance like this, and so you're always looking at the facts of your case, and we've got all of this that really supported that the Crown needed to take a second look and make sure that it wasn't just the consultation and accommodation, which they always think everything can be handled with money, right? They'll say, well, yes, you're impacted, and here we're going to give you an impact benefit agreement, and you can have some jobs and you'll get some money every year. You can't, and we said this at the court yesterday, you can't pay off an infringement. Like if it's an infringement, it requires a higher standard of decision-making scrutiny. That's what you're asking for. You can't buy that. It's about making sure that your decision-making process properly took into account the treaty rights that are enshrined in the Constitution now, that they're supposed to be protected. And the implication of the Crown being able to continue to make these decisions without stopping to ensure that there isn't an infringement is that they will make them again and again and again, and ultimately there will be no ability to exercise treaty rights, and then that will actually be a treaty extinguishment. And you can't extinguish treaty rights. They're constitutionally protected. No government has the jurisdiction to do that. So the implications are very broad. It's a really important case, not only for Site C and for the Peace River Valley, the First Nations there and the people that live there, but for all Canadians, I would say, because one of the statements that a lot of the nations I work for say, we always talk about treaty First Nations, but they say we are all treaty people. So all of us as Canadians, because our forefathers entered into that treaty relationship, we're all responsible for the treaty. We're all responsible for ensuring that it's not violated and infringed. So we're really hoping that the Court of Appeal heard our message, and that BC Hydro in Canada didn't succeed too much in overcomplicating our message, because it's beautiful in its simplicity. It's such a clear, in our view anyway, of course your own case is always the best case because it's yours, but it does seem very clear to us that the Governor and Council, if they're allowed to make these decisions without ensuring that they're not infringing, that means there's no check on their power that ensures that they're not violating the Constitution. And then they will eventually necessarily make unconstitutional decisions. And if we have to keep running to court every time they do that, well, can we do that? I don't know. I mean, we can't do that, right? We can't do that. There aren't even enough judges. We can't even get court dates. So we can't do that, and that's not the way government should work. We shouldn't have to keep going to the court to get government to do its job. So we're holding out hope, and we have another appeal, like I said, in the BC Court of Appeal in December. And in the meantime, they're building this dam. The construction is ongoing. And it's, I'm sure you can all go online, and there's a lot of different websites and Facebook pages that show what's going on and keep people updated. I know it's a far away from Ottawa, but a lot of people took a bus here from there, and I guess it can be done. So, and I'm sure you'd all be welcomed over there in the Peace River area if you wanted to come and support any local events there. So thanks for inviting us here today.
Just they've started development, but nothing that they have done is irreversible right now. All they've done is cut some trees down, some old growth trees, but I mean, 100, 200 years, it'll be old growth again. Right? But there's nothing done now that's not reversible. We can stop this project and we can move on to better things.
I'll just go. So, thanks. I'm William David. I'm with the Assembly First Nations. I want to talk a little bit about why First Nations across the country have consistently supported the fight on Site C, as well as tie in a little bit some points about the Declaration and how the Declaration is relevant here particularly. I want to start with just a couple of propositions. They're very, very broad. I'm not going to go into all of them in depth because I'm not really arguing. But first and foremost, people have a right to exist, okay? I'm not going to get into that. And also that people have a right generally to be free of discrimination, or alternatively, discrimination is bad. And I won't go too deep down that road either. But two other things that are collateral to that is that people fundamentally have a right to eat. And when you make a treaty, it's a legal document that has some sort of legal effect and obligation on both the parties. Really, really basic propositions. And it's important to keep them in the back of your mind when you think about the Declaration, the history of the Declaration. So 9 years ago, I had the privilege of sitting in the General Assembly Hall watching a bunch of states that we had been negotiating with, that others had been spent decades negotiating with, vote for or against the Declaration. A number of them felt that the Declaration was too far. And I want to come back to that because I think it's really relevant here. Too far to be implemented legally. A bunch of them felt that it was nice words and generally aspirational, and then some of them felt it was flatly unacceptable. Canada, part of the latter group with a small set of states, each of whom over the ensuing 9 years have reversed their positions and fully support the Declaration to varying degrees. In the spring, Canada signaled that it was interested in full implementation of the Declaration, and we're looking forward to what that means. The point being that it's an evolution. Now, why do people say it's too far? And this is something that's really key with the Declaration, is that there's this perception that the rights that are articulated in the Declaration come out of thin air. So, for example, the right to self-determination, particularly as it relates to territorial rights, is not something that we just cooked up in a negotiating room and sold to states. For example, in the Americas, you have the Saramaka case from Suriname, which clearly links the right to self-determination to territorial rights where Indigenous peoples are concerned for very clear reasons, and sets up a series of safeguards in those situations where territorial rights come into conflict with state aspirations over resources, one of which is free, prior, and informed consent. That right is articulated in the Declaration, and as I said, it didn't come out of thin air. It's law-based. In fact, all of the rights in the Declaration are very carefully negotiated by states like Canada to be law-based and implementable. So they're not simply aspirational, as some of my friends and colleagues would state. And indeed, when you think about food security, the fundamental right to eat, it is something that's protected by the Declaration, as is the right to have a territory, both of which are implicated here, as is the right to have constructive arrangements or treaties recognized by states and given force and legal effect, given remedy. That's really critical because oftentimes what states are going to come back with is, for example, in cases involving food security and forced relocations, it's just not viable for us to actually ensure that the environment sufficiently clean so these people can exercise their rights over food. That's from a series of cases from Paraguay known as Sahoyamaksa and Yakeaksa. Again, not novel, and well-known and well-reputed throughout the Americas, law-based and easy to implement, at least in developing countries. Perhaps it presents more challenges in a country like Canada that seems to have an abundance of resources. Again, it's not for me to say. As I said, AFN consistently supports CITE on a consensus basis, and one of the reasons why is that these incremental infringements and violations of treaties can ultimately add up to a point where treaty rights themselves can no longer be recognized. And the same could be said for fights over Aboriginal title or rights that are currently before the courts, is that as you're actually trying to negotiate some sort of arrangement with the Crown, unilateral actions in terms of development projects can actually undermine whatever it is you want to do. And chiefs from across the country see that. Several chiefs from various parts of the country, and several First Nations from various parts of the country have experienced that, and have experienced the Crown later coming back and saying, well, there's no resources there anymore, and you survived this long, ergo no right. That's not acceptable. And it is actually, as Allison states, very clearly an extinguishment policy. Mind you, sometimes, in some cases, in modern times, more of a negligent one, but nonetheless, that's where the road goes, is to extinguishment. And so we're concerned when we hear people wanting, and especially governments, in this case BC and Canada, wanting to talk about, for instance, free, prior, informed consent or development pathways in the context, in an adversarial context, and in an adversarial context over the scope and content of rights. This is more a problem actually for First Nations that are seeking to establish rights and title. So it's actually particularly shocking that where First Nations have actually already negotiated and secured rights, and the Crown has already promised, in a very solemn way, in a constitutional document to enforce those rights, that you're actually still in an adversarial context. And to tie it into one of the key concepts in the Declaration, which is free, prior, and informed consent. And what free, prior, and informed consent is, I guess, could be subject to some sort of debate about what does free mean, prior, informed, and consent. It seems clearly, to me at least, that there was no consent given. If there was, it certainly didn't seem like there was an information flow. And it doesn't seem like anything was done prior to the actual decisions being made. But that's not the way I actually think about free, prior, and informed consent. I think about it as a holistic standard. And I would challenge everybody here to think about what FPIC means. And I would really challenge you to think about rejecting the all or nothing bill of goods that were being sold by developers and by governments right now. And it's the kind of thing I like to tell people, that if governments want to play an all or nothing game with free, prior, and informed consent and veto, for instance, they're not going to like what's on the other side of the equation. So we always think about FPIC and veto, and it always comes from governments and developers. And the reason why they say that is they're looking at it from their perspective. They're looking at it from the perspective of somebody has a project, and all they care about is their little project. And the inconvenience of First Nations rights are going to get in the way of their economic interests. So looking at First Nations is an impediment to it. And free, prior, and informed consent is a hurdle they have to overcome. And that's why it's being framed as a veto. Okay? It's because it's something that's going to stop them. Stop for a second and think about this from the other side of the equation, the other side of the table, the people that are actually being asked to provide their consent, okay? If you're a First Nation that's being asked to provide informed consent, you're not being asked to support your rights. You're being asked to surrender them and release them in a very specific circumstance, okay? You're being asked, in this case, in terms of this project, just don't exercise your rights, okay? Maybe we can mitigate in some other way, or we can let you exercise your rights some other way. We can reach some other kind of an accommodation. Okay, but please just don't exercise your treaty rights here. That's what First Nations are being asked. We're being asked to secure and provide First Nations in free, prior, and informed consent. And when First Nations can't provide their free, prior, and informed consent, when the Crown says that that's not something that's viable anymore, really what they're saying is that First Nations are never able to exercise their rights in the first place. And that's actually what I see when I see the CITE fight with Treaty 8, is I see the Crown coming back saying, it's just too much, it's too far, it's too inconvenient. Okay, we can't have you exercising your rights at all. Herefore, forevermore. And that begs the question of what is the honor and intent of the treaty? What's the scope of the treaty? What's the nature of the treaty promise? And what does reconciliation actually mean? Is it too inconvenient to even have treaty rights exercised anymore at all in this country? That's what I'd suggest you get out of an adversarial approach, where we can only have development, we can't have vetoes, right? We can't have any rights anymore. When we signed treaties, it was simply an expedient to gain access to lands so that we could later develop them for resources. I don't think that's what the spirit and intent of the treaties was. I don't think that's what this government thinks that they were. I don't think what many previous governments thought that it was. I think it's an extremely diminished view of free, prior, and informed consent, of treaty rights, of the right to eat, of the right to lands. And I really think it's the natural, is what one would naturally get out of an adversarial process when you're so driven to get a particular project, I don't care how big it is, through, that you would suggest that any exercise of First Nations rights itself is simply too inconvenient and is impermissible under Canadian law. It's not what our law says. It's not what our Constitution's about. That's not what the rule of law is. So I mean, that's a little bit more my personal view. I would say that from the Assembly's perspective, really what we see here is a perfect example of economic interests coming up to clash with treaty rights. The failure to have any kind of meaningful treaty implementation policy in this country, and the general impotence of the Canadian courts to be able to provide remedy for those treaties. And the reason is because you have to keep going back over and over again to argue every specific point again and again. And at some point it just becomes no longer economically viable, or you run out of time. Because they're just gonna go ahead and develop, or they proceed developing the project anyways. So that's just some quick thoughts on my part.
So, as Sarah said, I work for Amnesty International in Canada, and we had tried to get intervener status in the case that was before the Federal Court of Appeal this week. We didn't succeed, and this is part of a pattern where lower courts in Canada don't recognize the value of bringing in the perspective of international human rights law when it comes to the rights of Indigenous peoples. International human rights frameworks and approaches that are routinely used in other areas of law, such as labor law, rights of the child, very hard to convince lower courts of its relevance in respect to the constitutionally protected rights of Indigenous peoples. But sitting in the court yesterday, I think I saw one of the most compelling arguments for why we need the UN Declaration, why we need meaningful implementation of the UN Declaration. Because what I heard there was the government laying out an approach to the rights of Indigenous peoples that really should horrify us if we step back and think about what their proposal was. Starting with Historic Treaty, Treaty 8, and the obligations in that treaty, they cast those obligations as matters of contested rights. They turned that treaty into an issue of open and unresolved debate. Right? They're willing to say, well, we acknowledge it across the total territory, we accept the language of the treaty, but its actual application to the lives of the people of West Moberly or Prophet River, to the protection of this last remaining piece of the valley, as Chief Wilson said, oh, that's contested, that's complicated. That's beyond our obligations as a government to deal with that. How do they find their obligations? Well, after years of steadily narrowing the interpretation of the duty to consult, to accommodate, they turn around and tell the court, that's all you need. Consultation is robust enough to fulfill all our obligations toward Indigenous peoples in this country. Nobody should ask for more. And if, in the event, there are circumstances where a consultation fails, well, the onus is on Indigenous peoples to establish why it wasn't enough. And what's the mechanism for doing that? Well, Indigenous peoples have to take the government of Canada to court. And not just through a judicial review, like West Moberly and Prophet River have been forced to do. No, you have to come to court through a full, lengthy trial. One that would cost millions of dollars, one that would drag on for years, one that would leave the fundamental issue, in this case the protection of the valley, unresolved until in fact things really did reach that point of no return, where things got past that point of some trees that have been cleared and could regrow. Get to that point, as Chief Wilson said, where the harm is irreversible. That was the government's proposal. And what would its role be in that? If the onus is on First Nations to, in each and every case, prove their rights through such a long process, what does the government think its role is? Well, it seems to think its role is to stand and oppose the realization of those rights. Because implicit in that, and they're saying that this requires an adversarial process, is that they are the adversary. Right? And they're going to act as the adversary in the name of the Canadian public. This is what they define the public interest as being. So as Amnesty, we've worked alongside the Assembly of First Nations and other organizations who are here, like the Canadian Friends Service Committee, the Grand Council of the Crees, over many years to promote first the adoption of the UN Declaration at the level of the United Nations General Assembly and to push for its implementation. And the reason that we came into this work and the reason that so many organizations like the Grand Council and the AFN had been at it for 2 decades before that was that it matters. The alternative is needed. We need an alternative to the way Canadian laws have been interpreted and applied. We need an alternative to this adversarial relationship. And there's a reason why the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, in its calls to action, called the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples the framework of reconciliation. There was a reason for it. Because inherent in defining these rights, in recognizing these rights, rights to land, rights to culture, rights to control over one's future and destiny, rights to food, rights to water, recognizing them as human rights. Inherent to that is recognizing that governments have a responsibility, that they have a fundamental obligation to act for the fulfillment of those rights. It changes their role. If you recognize these rights as human rights, then your role must not be the adversary. The role of government must be the insurer, the protector of these rights. And that, I think, is a fundamental shift we need to accomplish. And if today we see the government of Canada failing on the test of CITE, failing to step in and stop running roughshod over the rights of the people of Treaty 8. And I mean, there can be no doubt that they know that the consequences of this dam are disastrous. They must know that their own environmental impact assessment has said so. So they must know this. The challenge is to convince them to act in a way to protect those rights. If the government is committed to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and wants that commitment to be something more than just words, wants it to be meaningful, we need to see changes in policy, we need to see reform in law. When the caravan that came here set out from the Boone's Farm on the shores of the Peace River, one of the speakers at the launch was Romeo Saganash, a member of Parliament who has a private member's bill that would see meaningful implementation of the UN Declaration by having a regular review and reporting to Parliament on its implementation and a regular review of Canadian laws to make sure that Canadian laws and regulations, such as the Environmental Impact Assessment Act, were in fact compatible with these obligations. More than anything, I think what we need is a fundamental shift in approach, where the government takes on and shoulders that responsibility that we expect of it. It will not be the adversary, but the ally and the partner. And I want to close on one remark about the UN Declaration, and I'll attribute this to our colleague Paul Joff from the Grand Council of the Crees, who has pointed out that when you go through the Declaration does talk about consultation, and it does talk about free, prior, and informed consent. And within that spectrum, the thing that it talks about across that whole spectrum is cooperation, collaboration, a relationship of mutual respect based on governments acknowledging and taking up that responsibility to be a defender of rights rather than an adversary of rights. And then, having said that'll be the last thing I'll say, what I should also add to that is that, as Chief Wilson said, the fight is far from over, and there are opportunities to make a difference. People in this room, people watching the webinar, there is ongoing, because of the approach currently being taken by the government, there's ongoing need to support the legal struggle. Raven Trust has been fundraising, and the fundraising that they've done has been critical to enabling West Moberly and Prophet River to be able to stand up for their rights in court. You can continue to make donations to support the legal struggle through their website, which is nositec.com. That is nosite-c.com. You can also speak out in a number of ways. There's a number of petitions online, a number of sites that support writing to members of Parliament because they need to hear from us. Amnesty International has just released a short report to galvanize campaigning in Canada and around the world in opposition to Site C dam because it is just so important and the standards that are at stake are just so important. And you can find that on our website, which is amnesty.ca/sitec. Thank you.
We have about 10 minutes or so for questions, if anyone has anything they'd like to ask.
I got a whole pile.
Does anyone have anything? Yes.
I'm a Prophet Carlton. I've been following this a long time because I'm from the area. And I would like a little more information on why the government thinks that it has consulted adequately. You know, like, I would think since Mitsku, did I say that right? Mitsku Cree, that obviously the treaty right infringement is there legally in the precedent. So why do they think that they have a permission to go forward? I don't understand.
Well, you can take it. I want to make, there is no definition of consultation. That's, for me, that's a problem because my definition of consultation is not their definition of consultation. You know, they allow us to blow off steam and then they go away and make their decision. That's consultation. No.
The problem in that being an accommodation, consultation legislation, or policy, I guess.
Well,
the Department of Indian Affairs, or whatever they're calling themselves these days.
She should be answering this.
No, this is good.
Consultation right now is being defined by the courts,
Right.
which they don't define it. They take you to that stage and they say, go back and work it out. Well, all that does is puts us back into a room in an adversarial position where they don't want to consult with us meaningfully, right?
It's a checklist.
Yeah, and what is meaningful consultation, right? Is it sitting there for an hour listening to us, you know, drawing doodads on the paper,
Dumping reports on.
and then leaving? You know, when Minister LeBlanc made his office made the decision to approve the DFO permits for Site C, they never gave us an explanation, a rationale. They never answered our letters and our questions, nothing. We sent all that information out to them, expecting to have a dialogue with them. And all we got back is, oh, we approved the permits. We met with you for an hour. Yeah, you go, right? Like,
And then when you don't meet with them, they say you're
yeah, you're being obstructive, right? And then they approve the permits anyways. You know, like, what do you do? Like, we're caught in a no-win situation. We have one of our counselors, actually my brother, says this quite often, Clarence. We're in a consultation we got a gun to the back of our heads and we're forced to walk off a cliff. That's our choice. What do? We can't say, no, we don't have veto, right? They've not done the studies to show that this Site C is over the threshold. So, you know, there's no cumulative impact assessment. They haven't done a regional strategic environmental assessment. The environmental assessment process doesn't look at the environment. Nobody looks at the environment in that process, right? If they had looked at the environment, took all the previous construction that's going on the Peace River, looked at what Site C is actually going to do, it's not for 400,000 homes. It's to expedite shale gas, coal mining, tar sands development. Well, that adds to the cumulative impact assessment. They never looked at that.
What's the Hartford legislation, right?
Yeah, and what's the threshold? Where's the threshold, right? At what point in time have they crossed over the threshold and our treaty becomes meaningless? Sorry.
No, that was good. Better than what I could have done.
I'm sorry. We've been on the ground for 10,000 years up there. We are the indigenous people of that area, right? And we're a hurdle. They push us off to the side. We're treated like lint, you know. And that's who we are. And it's hard to come, we were in Montreal, walking around Montreal, all these cultures, this melting pot of people being accepted there. And we're outcasts, right? In our own home. My mom couldn't walk down the street in her home. Wasn't allowed to go into a restaurant, right? There's a reason why South Africa came to Canada and looked at the Indian Act and went back and created the apartheid system. Because they figured out how to screw us over, right? The United States slaughtered 1 million Indians. Well, Canada, we can't do that. We're British, we're supposed to be higher than that. They figured it out sneakily, right? Get the Indians off the land, take the land away, you know? Sorry.
One thing that you talked about was the link between this case and the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And I know the government has kind of spoken about fully implementing that, but they definitely have also spoken about fully implementing all the recommendations from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and among those being recognizing the building treaty rights even inclusive of economic development. And so I'm wondering, like, did the federal government respond to that issue in any way? Like, on the one hand, saying, yes, we're going to implement the DRC recommendations, and on the other hand, it sounds like there's a case of possible infringement of treaty rights?
I would say we don't have a relationship with the federal government. Just speaking from the CITE perspective, and obviously let my colleagues to add something, but we don't talk to them. They don't talk to us.
Yeah.
We don't meet with them. That's why when the federal permits were issued, there was a lead up obviously to that. They did send the permits to the First Nations for consultation, and no one had a process. We didn't have any sort of, in our consultations with provincial governments, we have, we have agreements. There's capacity, and I'm not saying it's perfect. It needs work, but we have a relationship. We know the rules. We know who the players are. We didn't know what to do with these federal permits, and we didn't have any sort of a agreement about how that would take place. We had no funding for it, and they said, "Oh, go get funding from BC Hydro." Well, why would we do that? Whose obligation is it here? So, for them to even suggest that anything to do with the TRC, how we would implement that in the context of Treaty 8 and development, they won't talk to us. There's no way they will talk to us.
Yeah, I mean, I would go so far. I mean, so I would suggest that this is a process that's adversarial, and so as a result, there's not going to be any of this talking as partners. And Craig raised a really good point that, like, when you think about treaty enforcement, Canada is a treaty partner. It's really worth questioning, like, why isn't Canada actually intervening to support the treaty here, right? And I mean, I understand that that's awkward, but I also understand that other similar jurisdictions to Canada do that routinely. What I would say is that, on one hand, because you're adversarial, Canada won't talk about it in this, like, to them. But more broadly, it's worth considering that when Canada committed to full implementation, when Canada committed to, like, change the regulatory regime, because there's this big change going on to the CIA right now, they were also pretty explicit that they're gonna, anything that's already in process is gonna continue under the old rules. So if you're looking at, for instance, like Energy East or either of the major pipelines in BC or Site C, you're gonna be stuck under the old system. And I mean, Canada has been pretty clear about that. And to the extent that, say, I would try to raise Site C in the context of, say, like TRC, call to action implementation, they would basically tell us, well, that's part of a court case. We don't want to comment on it in a broader context. I haven't done that, but I strongly suspect that's the response that I would get. So, like, that's the other thing that's kind of disturbing about this entire line. And again, like, this isn't the only situation out there like this, but this is one of the more disturbing ones because it deals with fixed rights. Is that on one hand you have this desire to do something as full partners, but on the other hand, it's just not convenient and just not viable to actually fully implement it on everything starting immediately, which sort of leaves a pretty large number of First Nations in the dust, right? I don't know if you have anything.
Well, just to reiterate, I mean, the excuses that we hear are Well, the overall decision to approve the project was a decision of the previous government, and we're not revisiting decisions. Well, that's a policy position, and it's a position of convenience. It's not a rights-based position. The rights are real. The fact that the wrong decision was made by a previous government doesn't absolve the current government of its responsibility. But it's also a false argument because they're not inactive. This government has granted the permits that Chief Wilson spoke of. This government chose to take positions in court, as Allison explained, are detrimental not just to the people of the Peace Valley, but to all treaty nations. This government has chosen not to sit down and build that relationship with West Moberly and Prophet River. This is on them.
Now, I would actually take it a step further, is that we're not saying no. We've said that. There's alternatives to this, where they could work with us, we could work with them and build something that Canada and BC and West Moberly and all of the First Nations in Canada would be proud of. But they have said no to this, right? We're not the ones out there causing problems. They've chosen this path. They've directly said, no, we don't want a relationship with you. We don't care about anything you have to say. We're building Site C, and Canada's going to help us. And Canada's jumped on side and said, yeah, let's go, right? We don't care about you. Now, to me, accommodation and reconciliation would be to sit there and say, well, you know what? Site C, we could do that. But there's an alternative that would create a win-win-win situation for everybody. And because our relationship with BC and the First Nations there's no higher relationship that we consider, this is the path we should go down. Just out of that. Even if it's a little bit more. That's the accommodation measure. If it costs a little bit more, fine. But it's not costing any more. It's actually a cheaper, viable alternative. And they've said no. It's a political decision. They've got an election coming up. BC has an election coming up. They're trying to get votes. They got to put people to work because their LNG dream just went down the toilet with the global market. They promised the whole future of the Liberal Party was based on LNG. All these pipelines and everything that they were going to do. All that fell apart. The only thing they have now is Site C. 10,000 jobs, right?
Until it's built, and then there's 20.
Yeah. Right? One geothermal plant, 200 people employed year-round. Site C, 50 people can operate that.
20 they just
20,
announced.
yeah. Right?
Can you talk a little bit about what the alternative is that you would like to see?
Geothermal.
Can you repeat, sorry, I got a text from somebody watching the webinar.
Oh.
Can you repeat the questions that people asked? Oh, yeah, sorry, so the question was, what is the alternative?
A viable alternative is geothermal energy. They are drilling holes every day. There's 15,000 holes, 30,000 holes in the ground from all the oil and gas development up there. They know precisely what the temperature is in every hole that they drill, the downhole temperature. They know that there is geothermal capability. BC has produced a geothermal map. Canada has produced a geothermal map. And northeastern BC is a hotspot there. There's no greenhouse gas emissions other than the construction of the plant. But once it's in operation, it's clean fuel, clean energy, wind. You know, wind is intermittent power. When the wind blows, the turbines spin, it creates energy. The wind doesn't blow, they don't have energy. Well, if the wind's not blowing, why not run a gas-fired power plant? They amended the Clean Energy Bill Act in BC to allow industry to burn gas to self-perform energy so that they can pump the gas out of the ground. Why can't we do that? It doesn't make sense. We went to them and said, you know, you amended when they put the Clean Energy Bill Act in place. CAP, Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, went to BC and said, hey, you can't do that. If you do that, that means we can't flare our gas. And if we can't flare our gas, we got to shut down. So BC amended the policy and allowed them to burn gas to flare the gas off. Well, LNG came up, and LNG said, well, we can produce our own gas. The gas that comes into our plant, we can burn it and produce energy out of that. So they amended it a second time to allow LNG to burn gas. Site C is only going to create about 11,000 megawatts of power, 1,100 megawatts of power, not 1,000. One gas-fired, one LNG terminal, 800 megawatts takes to run that thing. So one LNG terminal negates the whole Site C thing. Well, there's 5 of them being proposed in BC. What are they going to do? They're already they've exceeded the expectancy of Site C. So they allowed them to burn gas. We went to them and said, well, you know, you amended the clean energy policy for CAP. You amended it for LNG. Why don't you amend it one more time? We'll develop a gas-fired power plant. We'll work with BC Hydro. Oh, no, we got a clean energy policy. We can't do that. That'd be violating it. Oh. Yeah, oh, okay. Like, solar. There's more daylight, sunlight energy in northeastern BC, as much daylight, sunlight energy in BC as Miami. They're not looking at that at all. They can do alternative run-of-the-river projects on the Peace River. That would be acceptable. Build the power as they need it, not create all this energy and put it out in the market. That's why Christy Clark's over in Alberta trying to sell the power to Alberta tar sands, because there's no need for the power right now. In the last 8 years, the power demand in BC has gone down, not up. So she's over in Alberta's trying to sell them power from Site C. They don't know where to go with it. Well, you build the processes in incremental stages as you need the power. Run of the river, wind farm, a natural gas plant. They got a plant sitting in Vancouver called the Brard Inlet plant. They can refurbish that for $1 billion. Have a state-of-the-art gas-fired power plant. Alberta just built 2 of them. There's nobody screaming about Alberta, right? Like it's just BS is what's going on here, and we're the ones getting shafted. And it's not just us. It's going to be generations of BC people and maybe Canadian people that have to pay for that damn thing. It's $8 billion. It's going to be 15. It's going to be the most expensive project in Canadian history. For what? So they can get reelected? I'm probably the wrong person to be sitting here. I'm a little too passionate about this.
So we may have time for one more quick question. If anyone has anything. Yes, question.
You're interested in gas yourself, but are you not concerned about the water being taken out of the water cycle in order to do the fracking for the gas?
There's
Sorry, so the question is that if there is a concern also about the water being taken out to do the fracking for the gas.
Right. There is an existing industry in BC. The issue with LNG is that it's the primary coming from shale gas, which is water intensive for fracking. We always have a concern with that. You know, and we're not saying produce shale gas to produce this energy. They got an abundance of gas coming out of the ground now. They can tap into any one of the 100,000 kilometers of pipeline that's in the ground and cycle some gas, existing gas out of that and run a couple plants there.
This is conventional gas,
Conventional
not
gas,
fracked
not,
gas.
not frack gas.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's conventional oil and gas going on right now on top of shale gas. Well, shale gas is going on top of all that, so there's an existing industry there. There's over 35,000 wells in the ground right now up there. So, you know, if we're producing the gas already and it's there, and there's the technologies there, why aren't we doing it? They've got an existing plant that's already got gas going to it that they're shutting down because people in the Lower Mainland don't want to look at that eyesore. right? Because it's ugly to them. You know, they want to wake up in the morning and drink their lattes and cappuccinos and get in their SUVs and drive to work and not have to look at that ugly eyesore, you know, but destroy a valley up where we live. That's okay. That's out of sight, out of mind. As long as I don't have to look at it, that's fine.
Thank you.
She was asking about the water though, she wasn't asking about the gas. She was asking about the water being taken out to do the hydraulic fracturing, that's what she was saying.
So the,
She was talking about fracking, the water being used for fracking.
Yes.
She wasn't talking about conventional gas.
yes,
So from what I'm hearing, are you saying that it's okay for them to use the water from the Keys to do the LNG? Is that correct?
no. What I was trying to explain was that there's existing infrastructure in place there. They don't have to do LNG. They don't have to frack. They don't have to do that water consumption for that, to produce that energy, right? That's kind of separate from it. There is another issue with shale gas and fracking and the amount of water that's being used and what's happening with water and where they're getting the water from. So for that, that's another fight that we might wind up back here dealing with.
Yeah, I'd actually just like to chime in on that as well, because AFN has a separate resolution from Fort Nelson First Nation actually on water diversions for fracking. And I mean, it is a separate issue, and we could get into that here. But what I'd like to think about is how it relates to the declaration. And it is, in fact, one of these, it's very closely linked, because it's the same kind of situation you have here, where you have somebody out there came up with a brilliant idea, right? Let's frack this area, let's dam up this river, and approached the First Nations and said, okay, you're in the way, so let's just do what we have to do in order to get through this inconvenience, right? But that's not really what the declaration is about. It really is about collaboration, partnership. Nobody ever thought to sit down with the First Nations and ask them, like, what's your plan for this entire area? And what you're seeing in this part of the country is that increasingly these little chunks of territory and resources are being taken out until there's almost nothing left, and you're starting to look at extinguishment. And I don't care what the project is, how big it is or how small it is, all of a sudden it's simply just not permissible anymore to violate a treaty to that extent. So it could be a small gas station, or it could be the CITE hydroelectric dam. It's not my fault, okay, that BC and Canada didn't want to sit down and talk to Indians during the 50s, the 60s, the 90s. They didn't. The whole point of the declaration is to foster those kinds of discussions. Yeah, the 2000s, sure. And I mean, that's really the hope in terms of implementation. It's hard to have that discussion in an adversarial context, right? Yeah.
Thank you for the clarity.
Okay, so unfortunately, we are out of time for the use of this space, but on behalf of the University of Ottawa and the Faculty of Law, I'd like to thank our panelists for being with us here today, speaking about the CITE struggle and giving us a lot to think about in terms of reflecting on the past 9 years of the UNDRIP and where we should be thinking about in terms of moving forward with implementing the UNDRIP and in a way that is, as William David said, more collaborative and working together, drawing on Indigenous laws and legal principles. So thank you, everyone.
Yes. I had a whole pile of questions.
Sorry, I didn't, went a little bit off the map there.
No, it was good
But
though.
I do that.
Part of the, invoked a whole pile of questions.
Yeah.